Germany and its Jews is a complex topic. I'd like to emphasize 2 points in terms of this particular production. Firstly, I will not be concentrating on the Holocaust. I'll deal with the period essentially up to 1939, make some reference to what happened during the Holocaust itself, and then carried on from 1945, essentially until the present time. The other is that Berlin is really the center of Germany. Germany is made up of 12 different states, but as time goes by, the real activities of the Jewish population is in Berlin. However, on one or two occasions, I'll also relate to other societies. The main issue, the change within German society was as a result of Moses Mendelssohn. In the 18th century, Germany, and Berlin in particular, was very reluctant to deal with the Jews. The Jews were an alien people. Everything about them was different from what the modernizing German saw her or himself as. Mendelssohn came to Berlin, and although he was a religious Jew and he remained religious all his life, he was brilliant. And it was realized by some of the more important philosophers in Berlin, particularly Gotthold Lessing, that Mendelssohn really had something to contribute. Many of them never understood why someone as brilliant as Mendelssohn, a major thinker within German society, would want to remain being a religious person. But that is what happened. And he therefore became integrated into the philosophical society. It's interesting that while German Jews who so wanted to become part of German society respected him, were told once by a very important writer, Milton Steinberg, who made the following comment: Mendelssohn made the single most significant contribution to the dissolution of the Jews. Why would he say that? Well, Mendelssohn had 6 children, of whom 2 were Jewish, and more than 20 grandchildren, of only 1 was Jewish. And so therefore, from a certain perspective, and this will be very much part of what we'll be talking about, modernization and modernizing Jewish communities have also had a negative effect on the growth of the Jewish people. One of the most central thinkers who followed Mendelssohn's perspective was Abraham Geiger. Abraham Geiger, at the beginning of the 19th century, had been influenced by the overall Enlightenment, the growing Haskalah within German society, and this was happening in other parts of Europe as well. And Geiger realized very much on the basis of the New World that what German Jews needed to do was to become part of German society. And in Germany in particular, unlike most other parts of Europe, the reform movement, progressive Judaism, was very successful. The underlying thesis of Geiger was the comment that we see: all of Jewish tradition is an evolutionary process. That was to say that the Jews have to move. The Jews through history have never been exactly the same as their forefathers. And here we clearly see the great division which existed in the 19th century and is very much part of the Jewish world today in terms of the traditionalists, the Haredim and certain modern Orthodox, and the evolutionary people seen particularly with the conservative, reconstructionist, and reform movements. Part of Geiger's idea was the Society for Culture and Science. And Geiger and other modernists like him believed that Jews really had to move with culture and science. Science was changing. Science was important in Germany at the beginning of the 19th century. And therefore, if the Jews wanted no longer to be marginal, but to be central, they had to do this within a cultural, science, literary kind of environment. And that later stage became the Leo Baeck Institute, the sign of which still exists in Berlin. With the modernizing movement, you have the development of the rich Jews and the rapid upward mobility of about 5 or 10% of Berlin's Jews was quite amazing. Just a comment on language. Many of us mix up the terms. Assimilation is, in its real sense, giving up Judaism in all levels. Culturation is very much what the Reform movement wanted, and that was to live in a multi-leveled world of Judaism and Jewish religion together with the wider cultural environment that they found themselves in. This very quickly brought us to the First World War. And within a short period of time, before the First World War, Jews really wanted to show that they were fully part of German society. And here we have the amazing case of Martin Buber. Martin Buber, one of the great thinkers, the I-thou person, a person who believed very much in dialogue and peace, already described the possibility of a war as a liberating, quasi-redemptive communal experience. And this was the moment that Jews were totally convinced that as long as they were full supporters of the war, a very nationalistic moment of any society, that would enable them to be fully accepted. After the First World War, the situation in Germany is in a chaotic position. The Treaty of Versailles demanded of the Jewish and wider population to begin looking at the world in a totally new way. And there were high prices to pay for having lost the war. The Jewish population, by and large, was very excited with the Weimar Republic. And not only were they excited about it, but Jews quite quickly got into central positions, of which Walter Rathenau became the Minister of Reconstruction and the Minister of Defense in the 1920s, which really seemed to indicate to the Jewish population that Jews were accepted. They had been in the First World War and they were going to be accepted. Just to give some sort of idea of the figures that we are talking about, in the First World War, the population figures were the following. 100,000 Jews were in the army, 80,000 were in the front lines, 10,000 died. The Jews were very involved. However, there were no Jewish names on war monuments. And therefore, we begin to see that after the First World War, on the one hand, where many Jews had been very, very excited, we begin to see the amazing comment made by Gershom Scholem. Professor Gershom Scholem, who made Aliyah in 1923, is the foremost expert on Kabbalah. He wrote the definitive work on Shabtai Tzvi, the false Messiah, and his comment reverberated for many decades afterwards. He says in 1921, Jews loved the Germans, but the Germans did not love the Jews. This led, as time went by, as we get into the 30s, to the rise of National Socialism. And having been to Germany on a number of occasions, to Berlin and Hamburg and Munich, and you get into the history of the 1930s, you see that it seems on the one hand that the writing is on the wall. However, it was very, very difficult for the German Jewish population in 1933 to realize that the boycott of Jewish shops, for example, was a permanent phenomenon. After all, there had been anti-Semitism in all periods of history. It comes and goes. And they were pretty convinced, at least in 1933 and 1934, that things would be okay. However, by the time we get to 1939, we see that the situation had changed. In 1939, we see that Jews were searching for anywhere they could possibly go. Every now and again, when I'm speaking to a group about this phenomenon, people would ask the following question: how is it that the German Jews didn't realize that they should get out of Germany? Well, the truth is that 2/3 emigrated and 1/3 remained. 230,000 Jews had left Germany by 1939, and 164,000 had remained. And it was very difficult to find a place to go. No one wanted the Jews. For example, in America by 1924, there was already a policy of not allowing Jews into America except in certain cases. So we have to realize that the German Jews were not naive about what was happening, but the possibilities of getting up and leaving without money and without resources just overnight is not all that easy. We jump after the Second World War. We know what happened in the Second World War. The position was terrible. What we find about with the Jews of Germany and the Jews of West Berlin certainly was that many of them, the majority of them, actually left Germany. If they had a chance in 1945 to get out of Germany, if there was a place, a country in the world that would accept them, they would go there. We must remember getting to Palestine at that time was extremely difficult because of the British prohibition to high numbers of Jews entering. We find something in the region of 10 or 15,000 Jews in West Berlin and Germany, West Berlin and West Germany, after the Second World War. The question is often asked, how did they go back? Why did they go back? And the reason is fairly simple. Where else could they go, on the one hand? And secondly, this was their home. This was where they'd lived all their lives, 3, 4, 5 generations of families living there. They really hoped very much that Germany after the Second World War would be a very different Germany from what had been the case before. In East Berlin, the situation was more difficult. It was interesting that a few thousand, perhaps at one time, the figure is as many as 4,000 Jews. They were defined of Jews of the people of the Jewish race. That was the definition. They went to East Berlin because East Berlin and East Germany was under communism. And they believed that communism was going to be the answer, as Jews did in many other parts of the world. Having faced fascism and Nazism on the one hand, communism seemed to be a good alternative. As time went by, however, East Berlin became less and less comfortable. Communism became less inviting. And we find that where possible, at least until the wall was put up, and it was almost, one couldn't really jump over the wall except in a few cases. We find that the East Berlin Jewish community lives a very, very quiet life. We have a figure that says about 20 turned up to synagogue on Shabbat. And for the high holidays, if it ever got to 200 people, that was quite amazing. We must remember we're talking about 200 in the context of more or less 4,000. The West German direction was very different from the East German. West Germany very, very quickly recognized the wrongs of the Nazis. In fact, if we look at the response of most countries in Central and Eastern Europe, West Germany is in many ways an exception. If we try and analyze the Israeli-German, West German relationship, we see that there's been a number of very important events which showed that West Germany really was prepared to look at itself in a different way. In 1952, there were the reparations agreement, the start of significant amount of funds coming to Israel and to Jews around the world whose properties had been damaged or taken from them by the Nazis. In 1961, we have the Eichmann trial, and more important than anything else was the 1965 establishment of diplomatic relations. This picture that we see here, on the right-hand side, you can see David Ben-Gurion, and the fact that David Ben-Gurion turned up to Adenauer's, the late President Adenauer's funeral, is an indication of a new situation developing in the 1960s, which to a large extent has been true until today. German society, particularly on the political level, as I said, had come to terms with the fact that they had to change and they had to relate to past, an issue which has never been difficult in societies. But there were a number of events which forced the Germans to confront their past. One particularly good example was Daniel Goldhagen's amazing book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, Ordinary Germans and the Holocaust. This was the formative book which described that regular Germans were fully on board with the Nazi movement. And whereas many Germans had said, oh, this is just a small Nazi party, this book showed that regular Germans, for apparently no reason and what else, under any situation, would actually go in that direction. Time passed. And as we move into the late 1980s and 1990s in particular, we begin to see a new kind of situation developing. And this is what has been termed as the German Renaissance. The German Renaissance, and you see it in many parts of Berlin in particular, is that in the late 80s and 90s, it was almost the in thing to do things Jewish. It was an unusual situation, and many people who were going to Berlin in those years were kind of amazed and said, is this real? But there was this kind of feeling, young Germans in particular had rejected their past and really regarded the Jews as part of this new world that they wanted to be in. Unfortunately, we can't say that that has continued for all times. The building of memorials has been one of the mechanisms that German society has really tried to show that it is a changing world. I won't go through all the memorials. For any of those of you who've been to Berlin, you know you can do a tour, a 3-day tour, just looking at the memorials. There's no end of them. And so I'm just choosing one or two case studies. In downtown Berlin, the Bebelplatz book burning memorial is extremely effective. 1995, with an Israeli architect, there is this, in the middle of the pavement, you look down, and what I regard as really one of the most unusual and effective memorials that I've ever seen. You look down and it shows you all those empty shelves. And that was about the book burning which went on under Nazi rule. And the 20,000 books that were burned is symbolized here by the totally empty shelves. Then we go on to the Jewish Museum, yet another major venture. And this is not a Holocaust museum. And I think it's very important to emphasize that what German society was doing, and this is the National Museum, National Jewish Museum, 2001, the idea here is essentially to show the good life of German Jews. And it's a very interesting building. It's the quite confusing part of it has an area where you don't quite know where you're going and where you're coming from, somehow to indicate what German Jews had felt, particularly in the 1930s. But the exhibits are very, very effectively done. And you see in what I've mentioned just in a few sentences, speaking about the philosophers who were Jews and the wealthy Jews who were very much part of German society. It's an excellent exhibit to try and show the wider German society. And when I've been on a number of occasions, it's always been very, very full. It really has been to say that German Jews were an integral part of our society. Unfortunately, in the last 2 years, it's been involved in some political events, but that is not the most important point. The other memorial is the 2005 memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. This has been very, very controversial. Firstly, it's in excellent real estate. The question came up over a period of about 17 years. Should there only be a memorial to the murdered Jews? What about the other groups who'd been murdered? The site itself is very confusing. You see in the picture someone jumping from one of those slabs from one place to another. And what we're really seeing here is that there are a significant number, 2011, gray concrete slabs, and there's no sign. So you don't really know what it is. Kids there jump around just thinking this is a playground. And unless you actually know that on the side of the building, of the memorial, you have to go underground, and there's an excellent exhibit there which shows you, describes the life of German Jews before the Second World War. But as I say, this has already been moves into the realm of a controversy. And when I've been there and spoken to members of the Jewish community, some of them say there's a moment when we have too many memorials. We mustn't always be so much out there. There are those who say, on the other hand, that you have to constantly emphasize the point, or else a society will not really understand what's going on. The other realm where we see the Jewish past is in the cemeteries. The Wyszynski Cemetery is massive. It's actually quite beautiful. Lots of trees, very green, by and large well kept. Apparently the largest, or some people say the second largest cemetery in Europe, over 115,000 graves. And this is the third of the three cemeteries in Berlin, which all, in each case have historical importance. And you can learn, as we know from many societies in the world, you learn about the living by going to see the dead. There's also the development of synagogues. And there were some lovely synagogues initially in East Berlin. This particular synagogue is gorgeous. It is massive. But I must admit, going into synagogues, either as a tourist and every now and again being there for Shabbat and going to a service, I always have this strange feeling. It seems to be that so much money has been put into synagogues, which have their value, and yet the people who are at those services are by and large not the local population, but serve in many cases almost as much for the tourist as for the local population. The new synagogue, the Centrum Judaicum, which was restored in 1995, is absolutely beautiful. It's an unusual structure. It was a massive building in the center of Berlin, and they haven't reconstructed the whole building, but you know how large it was. This, by the way, is a museum. There are certain, on the second and third floors, there's facilities for services. Certain groups use the facilities as a synagogue. And for the rest, it's also a cultural center, and lectures are given there. And it's really a kind of very much in a positive way speaks about the Jewish presence. In Munich, there's an unusual synagogue, one of the most unusual and interesting ones that I've ever seen. It was a massive project built in 2007, the Oil Jakob synagogue, which was very, very expensive. It cost approximately 72 million American dollars. 72 million American dollars to build the structure. Amazing investment. You can see the synagogue over there. There's also a community center and a museum and a library. It's a whole structure. And the unusual part of it is that you go into the main building and then you have to go through a corridor. And as you go along the corridor, you see the names of the 500 and several thousand Jews who were from that Munich area who were killed in the war, and their names are down. You go into the synagogue itself. It's a lovely synagogue. It has 550 seats there, and that's really the place where it's comfortable and not too large, not like some of the other ones that we see in Germany and other parts of the world. Unfortunately, there have been anti-Semitic activities around there, and outside this synagogue, where I went for a Friday night service, as in many other places, you have a very clearly defined police presence of the local police force. At the beginning of the presentation, I spoke about reform. And for after the Second World War, as in most parts of Europe, Orthodox Judaism took over. The Gemeinde that you see, that you have in Germany in all the towns with a Jewish population, is essentially an Orthodox controlled Gemeinde. Reform Jewry came back wanting to say that this is where Reform Jewry had started and this is where it should continue. And they have a number of small communities, but one of the more exciting projects that the Reform movement has is the Geiger College, which now has its building in Potsdam. It previously was in Berlin. And this is a part of the willingness of German universities to increasingly introduce Jewish studies programs within the regular university programs. Here we have the synagogue in Berlin itself, which is interesting. It's a liberal synagogue, which is the term which they often use in Germany for the equivalent of reform. It has a choir and an organ, but men and women sit apart. There was an interesting little event there in 2019 where an American liberal Jew decided that she wanted to object to the division between men and women within the synagogue. And she'd written some quite harsh articles. So as she came into a service, the German police were waiting for her and quickly pushed her out of the synagogue. She was very angry with it. It just goes to show that the tensions of prayer and how prayer should be carried out is still alive and kicking in Germany as in many other parts of the world. Also, from the 1990s, the Chabad came in. The interesting thing part about the Chabad is that they have approximately 18 rabbis in Germany, many of them, as we know about the Chabad all around the world, serving a very small population. Chabad altogether has over 3,000 emissaries, so it's not surprising that they'd be in Germany. But what the Chabad in Germany realized, as much as anything else, was that it wasn't going to be adequate just to have synagogues in German, but you had to have it in Russian. And the reason is, about 10 or 15 years ago, it was realized that the overwhelming majority of Jews living in Germany are Russian speakers. In fact, today they maintain that the figure is between 80 to 90% of all Jews in Germany are Russian speakers. The majority of those Russian speakers were not interested in synagogue. They had received very advantageous conditions by the West German government. They could come from Eastern European countries and were given excellent conditions. By the way, as time went on, the plans were somewhat changed. But I remember at a certain time having been in Ukraine when the economic position was awful, and many of the Jews there were talking about the fact that the only place where they could live economically on a comfortable level was in Germany. Not only that, not only do you have the influx of Russian-speaking immigrants into Germany, but you have the return of German Jews, Holocaust survivors, who, and I met some of them in Berlin, who say that the conditions as a Holocaust survivor in Germany is much better than anywhere else, and certainly much better than in Israel. And in addition to which, in Berlin in particular, you see a very definitely growing number of young Israelis who have settled in Berlin. They are aware of the anti-Semitism, but they say that there are economic and other opportunities for them which they don't feel they can find in Israel. The Masorti conservative movement is also involved. They're working very hard on establishing a college, somewhere on the model of the Geiger College for the Reform movement. Once again, very active, that's the Masorti movement has actually managed to be quite successful in reaching both the Russian-speaking and the German-speaking clientele, which is not always such an easy realm to do. There is definitely anti-Semitism in Germany of different kind. And at least from what we see in the press, it seems that it is absolutely awful. Now, I don't want to undermine, and I don't want to say that the threats aren't there. And I don't want to say that there haven't been some very, very problematic attacks on Jews, on Jewish shops, and people shouting out anti-Semitic comments. And there's certainly the growth of the radical right-wing neo-Nazi factions. That is true. And the swastika daubings exist, and the damage to cemeteries exist. That is all true. However, every analysis in the world has to be a relative analysis. And so therefore, to look at this as the second last slide might be an interesting comment. The November 2019 ADL, Anti-Defamation League Global Anti-Semitic Survey, shows something which in some ways contradicts the viewpoint that many people have about German anti-Semitism based on mainly newspaper reports. We see that the overall anti-Semitism figure is 15%, which is a very, very low figure. Just to compare it, in Greece, it's over 60%. In countries like Poland and Hungary, which is over in the upper 40s, somewhere almost 50%, 15% is a very, very low figure. Just to quickly look at some of the components. Here, as in all cases that I have studied, men tend to be more anti-Semitic than women. Here we see a positive component, which we cannot always assume, and that the young people are less anti-Semitic than the old. We here see a phenomenon which is true absolutely everywhere that I've studied. Muslim anti-Semitism is particularly high. And in cases where you have both Christian and on the one hand and atheist or non-religious people on the other, it is interesting that there's the anti-Semitism of the non-religious or the atheist tends quite often to be just a little bit less than the Christians. To take a few of the figures, and not all the statistics that are dealt with in the survey, the feeling, and this is global actually, Jews are more loyal to Israel than to Germany, 49%. Jews still talk too much about what happened to them in the Holocaust, 42%. And this, by the way, fits in with this question of this excessive, for some people, I'm not saying it's necessarily true, some people maintain the excessive number of memorials related to Jewish topics in Berlin. Just want to make one additional comment, by the way. There has also been a definite attempt by the West German government in the last 15 or 20 years to relate to other groups who suffered, homosexuals, the Roma, the Gypsies, and groups like that. In addition to which, by the way, and not to do with the Holocaust, one of the main streets just next to the Brandenburg Gate is named after Yitzhak Rabin. So there's definitely a relation to broader issues, not only Holocaust. People hate Jews because of the way Jews behave is 31%, And then we have too much control, and there's a problem with that last one. It's actually 22% Jews have too much control over the United States government. To conclude, Angela Merkel has been a very decent friend of the Jews of Germany. And last year, she made the following comment. There is to this day not a single synagogue, not a single daycare center for Jewish children, not a single school for Jewish children that does not need to be guarded by German policemen. And this is Angela Merkel's feeling, that although I've said that the ADL commentary on anti-Semitism is low, Angela Merkel, and there's now a commissioner in charge of anti-Semitic phenomenon in Germany, many people in the German government are very much afraid that what is going to happen is that the anti-Semitism level will increase with time. To conclude on a happy note, Rabbi Leo Beck, who died in England in 1956, did something which I think shows a very impressive trait about Jewish leadership. And in September 1933, he became president of the National Representation of German Jews, which is the senior council of German Jews. And in it, he stated that he was devoting himself to defending the dignity of German Jews, and he elected to stay with the last minyan of Jews in Germany, and was thus to be called the shepherd of German Jewry. That is exactly what happened. He waited right till the absolute end. By the way, he had apparently some kind of influence even with the SS. They respected him, and he stayed on, and he demanded that he could stay on in Berlin until he had absolutely no congregation to work with. And at that time, he was taken to Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic today. He lived, he did not die in Theresienstadt, although the conditions were terrible. And after his release, he went on to live in Britain. Thank you very much.